Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of myNewsWrap, news from the SAP and Microsoft area, episode 18, second one in this new year, 2021. This will be a bit of a shorter episode. There are not that many news from the SAP side of the house, but I think I have quite some news from the Microsoft side of the house. So let's switch into the news area, starting with some more general topics. I guess you all came across the announcement last week, at the beginning of last week, that there is again a change within the management board, within the executive board of SAP. So Adair Fox-Martin will leave at the end of this month. Although she had a contract until 2025. So yeah, no idea what the reasons are, but she's leaving, and there are two successors that will extend the executive board, Julia White and Scott Russell. What's interesting from my perspective is that Julia White comes from Microsoft. As you know, if you're watching this myNewsWrap, there was another change at the beginning of the year, also with one member of the executive board coming from Microsoft with a very long history in Microsoft. So I'm quite curious to see how this works out, especially with respect to SAP Embrace in the future, because now there are two members of the SAP executive board that have a very long history in Microsoft. So I referenced the official press statement from SAP in the show notes, as well as three further links with respect to what Diginomica wrote about the departure of Adair, what Handelsblatt and what Wirtschaftswoche commented on this change within the board. So yeah, let's switch to the less political, more technical stuff. There are some news around SAP Cloud Platform that I want to draw your attention to. One is the new release of the SAP Cloud Connector. As you all know, one of the most important ingredients when it comes to connect your backend system, your on-prem system, to SAP Cloud Platform. I think one of the coolest tools that SAP has. Why? Because they work. This Cloud Connector just works. It does what it should do. And there is one very important enhancement with respect to monitoring. Because if you have an error within the connections, you will spend quite some time in that area, logs, monitoring, and so on. And they improved this area quite a bit. So yeah, I think take a look at it. It's really nice to see that they are improving there in the right areas. Then there was a second blog post that is really interesting, and that's around Cloud Foundry and Kubernetes, specifically Cloud Foundry on Kubernetes. As you might have seen or guessed, over the last years, Cloud Foundry is not the hot shit outside of the SAP ecosystem. There is not that much velocity around bringing Cloud Foundry forward. It's more like getting Cloud Foundry on top of Kubernetes, or combining Cloud Foundry with Kubernetes, exchanging all the internals, all the mechanics within Cloud Foundry with Kubernetes functionality. So exchanging all this Diego and container management within Cloud Foundry with the Kubernetes stuff. And this blog post kind of elaborates what's the situation today with respect to Cloud Foundry, and how the different initiatives that are working on bringing Cloud Foundry on top of Kubernetes are working together. So this is really an interesting read, especially if you are working in the Cloud Foundry area, because I think there will be quite some benefits when running it on Kubernetes. And there are also some benefits on the other way around, because Cloud Foundry is quite comfortable for developers. So it's really pushing your code and you're quite good to go. Kubernetes is still a bit more cumbersome for developers. For sure, it's also from the perspective of abstraction, a level below Cloud Foundry. So one has to be fair when comparing those two approaches. But interesting read, highly recommend it. Then there is another announcement that was made on Twitter. That's very interesting for partners. As you might know, especially if you are a partner, you definitely know it. There is more than one price list that SAP has. There are, I think, at least 5 price lists. And it's always quite interesting to see when the different services also arrive on the different price lists. And now, good news for partners. There is now a test, demo, and dev license for the SAP Cloud Platform Continuous Integration and Delivery Service. So for all the partners out there who want to get their hands dirty on that, yeah, you're fine now. And that was already it from the area of SAP. So there have not been any news, at least they did not cross my path, concerning Kima, concerning CAP, concerning Steampunk. Nevertheless, I'm looking forward to next week's SAP Rise event. Still no idea what will happen next week, but I think I will have more insights after the announcement next week. So let's see. Let's switch to the Microsoft part of the house, to my beloved area of functions. And this week, after 2 long months of not having Azure Functions Live, so the monthly live stream of the product management of Azure Functions, this week it was here again with a lot of new announcements that came out over the last few weeks, not to say the last 2 months. Most of the announcements I have already published within my myNewsWrap, but there are some points that I want to highlight. Anyway, you should watch the full episode of Azure Functions Live January. Definitely worth watching. I think there are 3 things that are really interesting and should be highlighted. One thing is that the Azure Function Core tools now provide support for KEDA 2.0. KEDA came out, I think, in December. So there it was GA. And the Azure Function Core tools now provide support for that release, which I think is really great news. Then there was one announcement with respect to the continuous deployment option for Azure Functions. I don't know if you yet came across that one. There is something within the Function app portal area that's called Deployment Center, where you can, let's say with very few clicks, set up your CI/CD pipeline using Azure DevOps or GitHub, or as you see for those who watch that, from Bitbucket or a local Git. And this is currently in preview and will be made general available probably at the end of February, somewhere around that. And then there was one other announcement that will come probably in the first quarter of this year. I think I already announced that there is now for Azure Functions a retry policy. So whenever an Azure Functions runs into an error, before that or without applying a retry policy, it fails. That's it. Now you can apply a retry policy for Azure Functions. That was already possible for durable functions quite before. That does, based on 2 strategies, trigger retries of the execution of your function. Now, up to now, you just could configure the strategies of the retries and the let's say time intervals, how the retries should be triggered, but you did not get any insight when you are within a retry loop which retry is this? Is this the second retry? Is this the third retry? And this will come. There will be a retry context that will be handed into the function that you can then evaluate and maybe act differently depending if you are the first retry or the last retry within your retry, let's say, interval. So that's I think really cool. That really helps a lot when you think about circuit breaking. I'm really looking forward to that one. Then one further post by Barbara. Oh man, I forgot the last name. She is currently super active in the area of durable functions and PowerShell, and in general PowerShell functions. And here she has one blog post about deploying Azure PowerShell functions with GitHub Actions, really guiding you through the whole process, also setting up your Azure credentials in GitHub and so on. So really great read. From my perspective, especially interesting if you are working in the area of operations, because PowerShell functions really help you to automate things. So cool. Then from the, let's say, low-code side of serverless, we have the Azure Logic apps. I already broadcasted that they are now basically running anywhere. So you can do that in a containerized fashion. You can run them on locally. You can run them on IoT devices. And there's one blog post that dives deeper into the service bus trigger. What you can do with the service bus trigger, especially with respect to batching messages. So not fetching each message from the service bus one by one, but retrieving it in batches, which usually improves your performance. And also with session handling, because you have some session awareness within service bus that you can now also use from Azure Logic Apps. Then with respect to the Azure Logic Apps, there's also one further improvement. As you definitely know, is that with Azure Logic Apps, you can connect to a lot of functionalities within Azure, but also within the outside. And now there is one improvement that allows you to authenticate with a managed identity for connectors that are Azure Active Directory OAuth based. So what does this mean? Usually when you connect to a resource, you get some key or something like that, and you have to manage that key basically or properly within Keywall. You have to make it accessible within Azure Logic Apps and so on and so forth. Now this is switching the game a bit, because now you can use managed identities and use a role-based access model in order to access resources within Azure Logic Apps, and you do not have to tingle around this key management. So that's really cool. There is also a list of supported resources. Yeah, great news. And one thing that I want to highlight, because I said you can run your Azure Logic apps locally, you can also develop them locally within VS Code. I think I also brought that up. And that was one tweet by Jeff Holland, who is product manager for Azure Functions, and or I think in the whole serverless area. He's also quite active in the Keto area. And he highlighted here the local development. And it's not only that you have some kind of restricted local development, but you really have all the connectors that I mentioned before and all the actions available within your local development environment. So that's really, really cool. So if you're around Logic Apps, take a look at that, because that really improves the developer experience a lot. Then I have one news from the Kubernetes area, one blog post introducing the so-called Kubernetes Event Grid Bridge, which allows you to bring Kubernetes events via the CMCF Cloud Event Standard to Microsoft Azure. This blog post describes basically the architecture on a very high level, how things work, and also tries to explain what's the motivation behind that to get events from Kubernetes outside to Microsoft Azure. Yeah, very, very interesting read. And I think a very cool initiative to bring the worlds even more together. So let's see where this is going. Then we are in the area of SAP and Microsoft. So bridging the two worlds. What are the news from that area? There was another, as usual, great episode of SAP on Azure video podcast last week. And it focused on logic apps in order to tackle integration topics. A quite extensive session all around demoing what's possible with the SAP connectors within logic apps, because there are pre-built SAP connectors, so you do not have to build up things from scratch. And yeah, definitely worth watching from my perspective. Then we have one mission that crossed my path last week that I want to draw your attention to, just because I think that's basically a very interesting scenario. So publishing documents from the SAP S4, in this case cloud system, to a SharePoint system, making use of the SAP Cloud Platform. The overall architecture of the story is a bit weird from my perspective. That's not how I would expect it. But I think it's some food for the brain, some triggering of ideas how to combine SharePoint with SAP S4HANA, which from my perspective is a very interesting use case, combining those two worlds. Okay, one last thing from the area of SAP and Microsoft. There was one blog post more from the infrastructure side, so not my home turf, with respect to data encryption on the SQL server, making use of Azure Key Vault. Why did I highlight this? Because I think there is quite some benefit in combining, let's say, infrastructural IaaS functionality with high-level services when you think about DevOps. So you do not have to do everything on the very low level of IaaS. You can bring in a lot of value if you mix that up with some high-level services, like for this example, Azure Key Vault. So it's by the blog post itself is by Bartosz Jakowski, also a well-known member within the area of SAP and Microsoft. So definitely, again, an interesting read. Then let's go to the events that are coming up. There is one event that's now right around the corner. That's the DSIG Technologietage, the technology-based conference of DSIG. That will happen at the beginning of February, on the 3rd and of the 4th of February. So it's called, or the motto is called Hyperchange. So if you are, or if you have the option to attend, I would recommend to attend. There are really interesting talks from all the areas that DSIG has to offer. Focus, of course, is more technology. And it's a virtual event, so no traveling needed. Then I want to highlight something that I highlighted last week already. That's the AKS Zero to Hero, let's say, video podcast by two Microsoft MVPs. That is currently gaining speed. So they pushed out 2 episodes this week, all around Kubernetes, all around AKS. I really like the format. And if you are trying to get your feet wet in the area of AKS, in the area of Kubernetes, I think this is a really nice way how to get into the topic. Then last part, as usual, developer productivity. So Windows Terminal is, I think, one essential part when it comes to developer productivity, and there seems to be quite some improvement with respect to configuring the Windows Terminal, because up to now, as you might know, you have to do quite some entries in a JSON file. And according to this tweet that I referenced, there is some usability improvement on the way, making it possible to design or set up your settings for the Windows Terminal in a UI-based manner. So that's really, really cool. You can still go to the JSON file as far as I can see that from the screenshot, but all the basic settings can now be done in a more decent way. Okay. Yeah, that was it with this week's myNewsWrap. I hope I had some interesting news for you. Next week, I hope we will learn something what's behind this mysterious thingy called SAP Rise. Until then, I wish you a nice Friday, nice weekend. Have a good time. Till next week. Bye.